Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Karen Finn, and I am thrilled to be here on the Mind Journal's live broadcast. I'm a life and divorce coach. I help people with every facet of divorce from the moment it enters their mind as a possible solution to the challenges they've got with their marriage, all the way through the process of divorce, if that's what they decide is the best path for them, and onto the other side of rebuilding a new life for themselves and even co-parenting issues. So as I mentioned, I'm thrilled to be here with the Mind Journal, and they've given me a wonderful topic to chat about with y'all today. And the topic is how to fix an unhealthy marriage. Fixing an unhealthy marriage is really a complicated issue to address because, frankly, what isn't healthy, right? You have to know, first off, whether your marriage is really unhealthy or if maybe there's something else going on. And I think that we can look at it through the lens of this question. How do you know you're in an unhappy marriage? And if you are, how do you fix it? Okay, so let's address the first part of that. How do you know you're in an unhappy marriage? And this can be an incredibly confusing question to try to answer on your own because it's really hard to know whether you're unhappy or it's the marriage that's unhappy. A lot of times I find that it's kind of like asking the question of which came first, the chicken or the egg, right? It's confusing because there's valid points on both sides. And how do you really know? So, one of the things that I typically do with my clients is I ask them a question about their life in general. How's your life outside of your marriage, right? Do you have a full life? Do you enjoy your life? Are you doing things that you find inspiring and fun and like you're living your purpose? If so, then it sounds like it really might be the marriage that's unhappy. However, if you don't have a full, fulfilling, wonderful life outside the marriage, then it might be you that's unhappy and not necessarily the marriage. I'm not saying the marriage isn't unhappy, but I'm saying you kind of need to start with yourself first. Because once you take that piece out of the equation, it becomes much more clear to understand whether or not the marriage is unhappy. So once you make that determination as to whether or not you're unhappy or the marriage is unhappy, and it's come down to the marriage is unhappy, there's still another variable that you need to look at: your spouse. Because if your spouse is genuinely unhappy with their life, it can kind of go back into the marriage. So it'll make the marriage feel yucky, right? So if your spouse is the one who's unhappy with their life, right, then you can encourage them to find more meaning and fulfillment in their life. And one of the first things that you might want to try is shifting attitudes, right? So if you can shift your attitude and think about how you can become happier and actually live that out in your life, it will help you and it can also help your spouse. The reason for this is kind of weird, but it's kind of cool all at the same time, right? So if you are the one who's unhappy and you're focusing on how you can be happier, you're going to have a better shot of becoming happy because that's what you're focusing on, right? Have you ever heard what you focus on, you produce or you get or you create, right? All that kind of language around that. Well, it really works that way. So you can even try it out now if you want to do that. So if you're sitting down, you're watching me, and all of a sudden you go, woo, right? you'll start to feel a little bit more energetic, right? You'll start to feel a little bit happier. Your perspective is going to shift. Your attitude's going to shift. Now, if you're around someone who is genuinely upbeat and happy, have you ever noticed that you tend to at least smile a little bit more? Right? And that's because we have the ability as human beings, right, to actually pick up on what other people have going on, and we tend to mimic it, right? It's from way back when. It's one of the ways that we stayed safe is by being part of the crowd that we needed, the community, the tribe that we needed in order to survive. So if your spouse is the one who's struggling with happiness, if you consistently bring a positive, upbeat perspective to things, then chances are it will start to rub off on them. Now, it doesn't mean it's going to fix them, right? Because it's not your job to fix them. But at least you can start giving them the opportunity to recognize that there's room to shift. There might be room to change. And once you're both ready to change to make the marriage better, then you can actually do that. I hope that answers that question well enough. It's kind of a complicated one to tackle in a short time period, but if you have any more questions about that, please feel free to reach out. You can reach me at Karen@drkarenfinn.com, and I'll do my best to try to clarify anything. Or if you're live with me now, just pop a question in the chat, and we can get that. We can try to get that answer for you today. All right. So one of the common things that I hear people talk about when they know their marriage is unhappy, right, is actually the dynamics of the marriage that is not, they're not working well. The dynamics are just not there, is emotional neglect. So I thought it would be really great to talk about what is emotional neglect. If we're looking at it in a very tight nutshell, emotional neglect is the lack of emotional support or acknowledgement. You feel like your emotions are of no importance to your spouse, or your spouse may feel like their emotions are of no importance to you. And it's not uncommon, honestly, for both spouses to feel like they're struggling with emotional neglect at the same time. So I thought it would be important to share with you just a few signs of emotional neglect. So you're not just relying on feelings or reported feelings. So let's look at some signs. A belief of being alone, even when you're with your spouse, right? Your spouse doesn't know how to comfort you when you're experiencing emotional upset. You and or your partner frequently misread each other's true feelings, actions, thoughts, or intentions. And here's a real telltale one. Your spouse isn't the first person you want to turn to when something great happens or something goes wrong. And honestly, this last one is the one that was happening in my first marriage, the one that didn't make it. And I can tell you firsthand that it is incredibly painful to feel invisible to the person that you said you wanted to spend the rest of your life with. So if you are suffering from emotional neglect, or your spouse is suffering from emotional neglect, there's definitely work that can be done to fix the situation if that's what you all decide you want to do. So you don't have to give up hope, but it does require both spouses being on board. My marriage ended because both of us weren't on board. So it doesn't have to be the end of things. It just means there's plenty of work to do if you want it to work out. The next question that kind of goes along with the emotional neglect question is, how do you know your partner doesn't value you? And this one's very interesting because there are actually two sides to it, right? You can have the thought that your partner doesn't value you, and your partner could not value you, right? Have you ever had a thought that wasn't 100% true? Well, that's kind of what I'm saying can happen in this situation. So, when you have a thought that you are not valued by your spouse, it's your job to make those feelings of yours, those thoughts of yours, those sentiments, those interpretations known to your spouse in a brief, informative, friendly, and firm way. Fans of Bill Eddy will recognize that as the title of one of his books, Biff, B-I-F-F. And once you do that, right, then you have a chance to really discuss the situation and find out whether or not your spouse truly values you. Unfortunately, this can be a real stumbling block for a lot of people because it's so easy to say things like, you don't value me, you don't care, you this. And that can come across as really attacking. And when someone feels attacked, they tend to defend themselves. And that's when arguments can really take hold and spiral out of control. If instead of saying statements like, you this, you did this, you think this, you treat me like this, you can phrase it as things like, I'm feeling unimportant when whatever it is happens. I'm feeling unloved whenever this happens. Do you see how that might be able to create a conversation instead of an argument? It's really important how you phrase what's important to you in a way so that your spouse can hear you, right? Because that's the whole point of communicating, right? Is to make sure the other person understands what you're trying to say. And so it's your job to make sure that you can communicate to your spouse what it is that's going on. Then it's their job to listen, right? And if they're not able to listen, right, you can try going to couples counseling to see if that helps. And it also gives you more information about their ability to communicate with you, right? The other side of it is your spouse truly does not value you. If your spouse truly does not value you, they will purposely do things to undermine you. And I'm looking at my notes here because I want to make sure I capture everything. You know how it is sometimes when you talk to someone, you say, oh yeah, I should have said this afterwards. So I want to check my notes to make sure because I want y'all to have this information. So some of the things that your spouse could undermine you on are your beliefs and values. They won't be standing up for you with their friends or family. They don't prioritize spending time with you. They prefer to spend time with others or with their other interests. They'll even make fun of you in private and in public. And this is really akin to laughing at you instead of with you about things, right? And your thoughts and feelings simply aren't important to them. And so if this is what's going on, it's going to be really difficult for you to do anything about it, frankly, because their opinions, their behaviors are their problem. It's their responsibility to deal with. So you can try marriage counseling in a situation like this to see if there really is anything there. And if there isn't, right, if your spouse is just entrenched and not willing to do anything, then you might want to consider a separation to see if that can work. And if that doesn't work, then I think you know what your next steps could be. And I really feel bad about saying things like this, but there really are cases where divorce is the best answer. I don't think it's always the best answer, but in some cases it is, so that both people can be their best selves. Okay, so now on to another question that's a little bit more uplifting. And the question is love necessary for a healthy marriage? And I'm going to say unequivocally yes. And I'm not talking about the ooey gooey, I'm in love, I've got doe eyes all the time, kind of can't stand to be without my spouse. I'm talking about the love that endures, the love that is, I've got your back, I know you've got mine, right? Trust. I'm talking about, I know I can share my deepest secrets with you because you're sharing your deepest secrets with me. We really connect, right? And respect, right? So kind of the opposite of doesn't value, right? There's respect that happens when you truly love someone. You respect them as an individual. That doesn't mean you agree with everything they do, think, say, all of that stuff, because they won't do that with you either. But when you truly love someone, it becomes easier to do all of the things that are required to have a healthy marriage. So, yes, you must love your spouse, and your spouse must love you for a healthy marriage. All right. So, our next question is, how do you cope with it when your partner disappoints you every time? Now, the phrasing of this question for me is a little bit tough, right? You see, it's because I know that when people use phrases like every time, all the time, always, and never, right? They're in a more emotional state that's not able to separate a reaction from the facts of what's really going on. And it's natural. Everybody does this. I do this, right? And sometimes I don't catch myself doing it, right? But the truth is that when you're doing that, it's more out of a sense of fear of something, right? So if we take this back, right, we know that life is more technicolor than black and white, that this always and never, or every time, all the time kind of language is. And we look at it from the knowing, right, that there's lots of different options in between the two extremes. You need to look at when this happens, that you believe your partner is disappointing you, what's going on for you, right? So do you have expectations of your spouse that you have not communicated to them, right? If so, right, then you need to communicate those. And I do see this come up quite frequently because of the way that most people get married. And I know I'm going to take it all the way back there, but I promise it'll make more sense. So, you know how it was when you first fell in love, and you could complete each other's sentences. You always knew what the other person was thinking, right? You always just knew. And it was a wonderful, euphoric stage of your relationship. The thing is that kind of connection where you can complete each other's sentences all the time You can know what the other person is thinking. Doesn't last forever. So, although you were probably pretty good at this idea of mind reading with each other in the beginning, right? That's not how it works long term, because you're not spending every moment with each other in the same way you were at the beginning of the relationship. You don't have the same neurochemicals running around in your brains like you did at the beginning of the relationship. And this is where communication becomes really important. So, I also know that people tend to assume that their spouse thinks just like they do. So it makes sense that they should just know what I want. They should just know that that hurt my feelings, right? But the truth is that men and women's brains operate a little bit differently. Part of it's biological and part of it's due to our cultural norms, right? And even if you're in a same sex marriage, right, you're still two individuals, right? So your brains aren't going to be exactly the same, regardless of the fact that biologically, right, you have the same chromosomes, and culturally, you grew up in the same culture. Culture. I don't know why I'm stumbling over that word, right? So you are not the same person, right? So you need to communicate what's important to you, what your needs and expectations are, so that your spouse has a chance to say whether or not they can meet them, right? Just because you're married doesn't mean that your spouse has to meet every one of your expectations, just like you don't have to meet every one of theirs. You work together to see how you can take care of each other in the best way possible. So I hope that helps with that idea of feeling disappointed, right? There's really a lot of communication that needs to happen. And I know I used some language here about expectations and answering that question. So I think it's really lovely that the next question that I have is, how can expectations get in the way of a healthy relationship? When everybody has expectations, right? Everybody has them. We operate as a society knowing that when your front door is closed, right, that you don't try to walk in through a window to somebody else's house, right? We have an expectation of when we drive, right? If you're in the US where I am, when you drive, you're going to be on the right-hand side of the road, right? But if you're in the UK, right, you're going to be on the left-hand side of the road, right? So you need to keep in mind expectations culturally. You also need to understand that some expectations are appropriate and some of them not so much, right? So it's really critical that you are clear about your expectations, right? So expectations that I typically see within a marriage, right, are monogamy, right? Typically when people get married, they expect that they and their spouse will have only each other as sexual partners. However, there are some couples who have an open marriage, and they have certain expectations around what it means to have an open marriage, and they're happy, right? So it's incumbent upon the two of you to express what your expectations are for the marriage, ideally before you get married, right? So that you really know where each of you is coming from. And that way you'll have a better shot at meeting those expectations or compromising and adjusting those expectations to be something that is appropriate and is supportable over the long haul. The other thing is that life changes, right? The longer you're married, the more life's going to change. A lot of couples get married and have children. Talk about a huge change, right? Kids will take over if you let them, right? And your focus will no longer be on each other, right? They'll be only on your child or children. And so expectations around how you will parent, right, need to be discussed so that there aren't horrible arguments or upsets as a result. Um, it's it's very common for major life changes to inject new expectations into a marriage that, if they're not spoken about, they'll almost always be not met. And that can be very frustrating for both partners. That is all of the questions that I had prepared for us to chat about today. I hope that you have found this conversation valuable. I haven't seen any other questions come up, so I'm going to guess that most of y'all are going to watch this after the fact. And I'm going to invite you to comment, because we'll keep up with the comments, even though you're watching it after the fact, and to let the Mind Journal know how much you appreciate them putting on these lives. Oh, great. Here's a question from Christine. Christine asks, should you stay in a marriage if you are unhappy? How should someone know the limit? I'm absolutely in an unknown zone. Oh my goodness, Christine. Thank you so much for sending in this question. And, it really, I wish I had a magic wand to let you know exactly what's the best answer for you. The truth is, should you stay in an unhappy marriage? The answer is maybe, right? It depends on what's causing the unhappiness. Are there things that can be fixed? And do you both want to fix them? Marriage really requires both spouses wanting to put in the effort to make things better, right? Just because you get married doesn't mean that you're set and you don't have to work on anything anymore. It is also a chance to grow. Our partners are often a reflection of us. And I don't mean that as in a literal sense. I mean that as they give us the opportunity to look at places within ourselves where we may want to grow. And sometimes that growth is in creating boundaries, right? Boundaries that make sense, so that we have our own individuality in the midst of the marriage. Especially for women, I find that to be more common than for men. So there's no easy way that I can answer your question, Christine. And it makes sense to me that you're feeling in kind of an unknown zone, because nobody gets married and plans to have problems, right? We all get married and it's all going to be rainbows and unicorns. And the reality is often different than that. You can reach out to me if you'd like by sending me an email at karen@drkarenfinn.com, and maybe share with me some more of the details as to what's going on to make your marriage unhappy. And I can provide you with a few more ideas for how you might move forward in your specific situation. And just again, in general, if you do have an unhappy marriage, right, it's important that you figure out if it's you that's unhappy, your spouse that's unhappy, or truly the marriage together that's unhappy. And from that point, right, once you know the sources of the unhappiness, sources, I should say, then you can make better decisions about how to move forward in the best way for yourself and your family. I hope that helps, Christine. Are there, oh, good. Oh my goodness. Yajna, I'm so sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. What about infidelity? Years of it where the cheating partner even goes to live with a third person. What do we do? I am going to ask you how you feel about the cheating. Because if you're okay with an open marriage and you're okay with the situation at hand, then it's okay, right? If you're not okay, if you feel that your boundaries have been crossed and that it is completely inappropriate, then it's not okay. That's a difficult thing about marriage and relationships in general, because what's okay for one couple, right, could be really a horrible deal-breaking thing for another couple, right? And it's until you get really clear about what your values are, what's truly important to you, and what you want from your life as to whether whether it's okay for your spouse to be cheating like that. If it's genuinely okay because you feel good about yourself, you have a great life, and it's more of a marriage of convenience because you're both living your lives independently, then nobody can say anything to you, right? It's your life. You get to choose how you live it. And if it's not okay and your spouse is unwilling to give up the third party, then I think you know that the marriage probably isn't going to work out. And you need to figure out what's going to be your best way to move forward. I hope that helps. Are there any other questions that have come up? Okay, I've also watched your last session with the Mind Journal. A great session it was. And I've been meaning to ask, can a toxic marriage be saved? Oh, thanks, Kurt. I'm so glad that you watched the last session. It depends really on what you mean by a toxic marriage. Toxic is one of those words that can get thrown around and may or may not have the same meaning to people. So a toxic marriage can be saved. Okay, just, since it was a yes, no question, yes, it can be saved, but let me qualify that. Okay. Both spouses have to want to save it. Okay. If either spouse persists and insists on maintaining the behaviors, beliefs, whatever it is that's making the marriage toxic for the other spouse, then yeah, there's not going to be anything that's going to change in that marriage per se, because the one spouse is refusing, right? So you can be dancing and doing headstands and everything else, and as the other spouse is, hell-bent on staying in the recliner all day, then that's what's going to happen, right? There's not going to be any shift, right? In the marriage, there will be shifts in you, right? Because you will understand this isn't working for me. My life is more valuable than wasting it in a marriage that is really toxic to me. I'm sorry that I don't have a really direct answer on how to save a toxic marriage, because again, it depends on the two individuals, as every marriage is very unique. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of guidance, Kurt. Are there any other questions? Give it just another beat or two here. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I really want to thank everyone for tuning in live. I really appreciate the questions so much. And I'm hopeful that something that I have said today gives you a little bit of inspiration for how you might be able to move forward and fix your unhealthy, unhappy, or even toxic marriage in some way. Again, I want to thank the Mind Journal for having this wonderful live event and for allowing me to be part of it. I hope that you all are well, and I'll look forward to chatting with you next time.